27 October 1944, Leyte Gulf. Dawn leaks through storm-bellied cloud and the mangroves steam as night rain burns off the leaves. A Japanese reconnaissance pilot climbs above the haze, engine rattling, the cockpit thick with gasoline and salt. Below, the shoreline he charted as marsh only weeks earlier looks wrong. Straight lines where none should exist. A dark ribbon carved from swamp and then the impossible. American bombers nose into the wind and rise from ground that shouldn't bear their weight. Sunlight catches at a metallic skin, a chessboard of perforations glinting through the mist, pierced steel planking laid over mud, and the pilot swallows, tracing a runway that wasn't on yesterday's map. By the afternoon, reports scrape across wire to Tacloban and Dulag. Staff officers unfold charts that insist those flats are mangrove and muskeg, too soft even for mules, yet fresh sidings stack up, more steel matting, more taxiways slashed into green, revetments squatting in brine, fuel drums lined like beads. The air smells of rot and diesel. Thunderheads bruise the horizon, and still the Americans keep lifting off. In early November, the shock hardens into fear as those phantom runways spit out sorties, B-24s and B-25s arrowing along the Gulf, P-38s knifing inland, shredding depots, rupturing columns, setting supply barges alight so that smoke lies on the water like a lid. In mess tents and dugouts, the story spreads like a superstition. The Americans can grow airfields out of swamps. What erodes is not a position on a map, but the certainty that nature itself will defend you. How could mud become a fortress runway almost overnight? The answer is waiting in crates and blueprints, logistics married to engineering, and the tireless reach of the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, whose methods will define what the Pacific War can and cannot do next. By early 1942, the Pacific had become less an ocean than a vast chessboard. Its squares measured in miles of coral, jungle, and salt water. Every speck of land, Tarawa, Makin, Guam, Bougainville, was more than a name. It was a potential runway, a springboard toward the Japanese homeland. Between these islands stretched distances so immense that ships vanished into weather fronts for days, and every crate of fuel, every drum of water, had to cross seas where a single submarine could erase months of planning. Logistics ruled this war. Whoever could move men and machines across that blue wilderness would decide its outcome. Japan's empire seemed secure behind its island bastions. The Marshalls, Gilberts, and Carolines bristled with gun pits, camouflaged revetments, and reefs that promised to devour any landing craft. Coral atolls and swamp-choked interiors were their natural armor, and Tokyo's planners believed that no engineer could tame such terrain quickly enough to threaten them. In their doctrine, distance itself was a weapon, an oceanic moat impossible to bridge. But the United States, bruised by Guadalcanal's malaria and mud, learned a brutal lesson. Jungle and fever could kill as surely as artillery. Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific and General Douglas MacArthur advancing from the southwest grasped that airfields, not battleships, would dictate tempo. Control of the skies meant command of the sea below. And every new strip of pierced steel planking pushed the front line hundreds of miles forward. The island-hopping strategy was born from that realization, demanding bases that could appear almost overnight, on coral, on lava, even on swamp. By 1943, the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, were ready to defy geography itself. Their bulldozers would crawl through surf, their engineers would wrestle coral and mud into shape, and their runways would make the Pacific's tyranny of distance crumble under American steel. What began as improvisation would soon become an art of war. The secret weapon that turned swamps into strongholds was not a tank or a bomber, it was a 10-foot strip of steel. In 1941, the Carnegie Illinois Steel Corporation designed something deceptively simple, a corrugated sheet punched with neat rows of circular holes, its edges stamped with locking tabs. The engineers called it pierced steel planking, PSP. Each section weighed roughly 66 pounds, light enough for 2 men to carry, yet when interlocked it became a continuous mat capable of bearing 30 tons. To the eye, it looked like a metallic carpet. To the Seabees, it was salvation. Laid across mud, sand, or crushed coral, PSP spread an aircraft's weight evenly, turning impossible ground into a solid runway within hours. The first shipments arrived in the Pacific in battered cargo holds already smelling of salt and oil. By late 1942, engineers were unloading stacks of PSP on Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, learning its tricks the hard way, how to drive stakes through the lugs, how to curve it along drainage lines, how to patch the pieces when they bent under bomb craters. Where Japanese laborers hammered together wooden platforms from scarce tropical hardwoods, American Seabees unrolled steel roads that swallowed whole bulldozers. Japan's engineers, bound to hand tools and sweat, measured progress in weeks. The Seabees, armed with cranes and compressors, measured theirs in days. By 1945, American factories had stamped over 100 million square feet of PSP, enough to pave a path from San Francisco to Manila. In the swamps of New Guinea and the atolls of the Central Pacific, palm log corduroy roads were laid first, then gravel, then the gleaming steel matting, locked edge to edge until the jungle reflected sunlight like armor. PSP never earned medals or headlines, yet it embodied industrial war in its purest form. Steel conquering mud, machinery conquering distance. Its first true trial awaited in the Solomon Islands, where theory would meet combat reality. August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal. The dawn mist clung low over Lunga Point as the first U.S. Marines splashed ashore, rifles held high above the surf. What they found inland was not a fortress, but a ghost of one, an unfinished Japanese airstrip carved into the reddish clay, its edges bleeding into swamp. The invaders seized it within hours and renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, killed at Midway. The victory was swift. The struggle that followed would grind for 6 long months. Almost immediately, the monsoon began. Torrents fell in sheets so dense that visibility collapsed to a few yards, and the captured airfield dissolved into sludge. Jeep tires vanished to their axles, and the few aircraft that tried to taxi sank like stones. The Marines, running short on food and shells, now faced an enemy more relentless than the Japanese, mud. Yet even under artillery fire, they refused to yield. From transports anchored offshore came crates of a new material, marshland matting, an early form of pierced steel planking. The Seabees, still few in number, joined Marine engineers to drag the heavy panels through sucking muck, locking them together by lantern light as enemy shells screamed across the ridge. By September, the Cactus Air Force was flying again. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and Airacobras clawing skyward from steel that shone through the rain. Each sortie brought food, ammunition, and life to the men below. Across the jungle, Japanese troops stared upward in disbelief. The swamp they trusted to swallow machines had become an iron runway. For them, the psychological wound was deep. The Americans could make the earth itself obey. Henderson Field became more than an airstrip. It was proof that will, steel, and machinery could overcome any climate. The lessons learned in that inferno would echo through New Guinea, the Marshalls, and finally the Philippines. By February 1943, fragments of intelligence began filtering back to Tokyo from the shattered remnants of the Solomon Islands garrisons. Survivors' sketches and reconnaissance photos painted a picture that many staff officers refused to believe. The Americans were operating aircraft from what had once been pure swamp. At first, the Imperial Japanese Army's engineering department dismissed these reports as the product of confusion or morale failure. No steel, one officer noted in a margin, can bear weight in mud 2 meters deep. Yet the evidence kept coming. Aircraft silhouettes lifting from Munda, contrails over Bougainville, and reconnaissance photographs that revealed strange, glinting surfaces patterned with holes where jungle should have been. When captured cameras from downed U.S. planes reached Rabul's analysis rooms, disbelief turned to uneasy awe. The photographs showed airstrips like metal scales laid across the earth, taxiways arched over marshland, and revetments carved straight out of mangrove. The Americans, it seemed, were not draining the swamps at all. They were conquering them. Japanese field engineers attempted to imitate the feat with bamboo mats and log corduroy, but the tropics consumed them. Within weeks, wood rotted, nails rusted, and the heavy Ki-48 bombers sank to their bellies. By contrast, the Allied airfields endured monsoon after monsoon, supporting B-24s and cargo transports as though rooted in bedrock. Reports from Rabaul began using a new phrase, Kiseki Hikojo, miracle airfields. One frustrated officer wrote that, "Our own planes rot while theirs take flight." The shock was more than technical. It was strategic and psychological. The Pacific, once thought Japan's natural fortress of reefs and distance, no longer obeyed its defenders. Geography had been neutralized by industry. As the war dragged on and Japan's resources dwindled, its intelligence bureaus could only watch as America turned this hard-won innovation into an industrial system of expansion, airfields by the hundred, each built faster than the last. Across the continental United States, the pulse of industrial war never ceased. In Pittsburgh, the blast furnaces of Carnegie, Illinois, spat molten steel day and night, pouring it into the molds that would become 10-foot panels of pierced steel planking. In Detroit, the same assembly lines that once shaped car chassis now pressed and perforated runway mats, while in Oakland and Norfolk, naval depots packed the finished sheets into standardized crates, each box measured so that a single C-47 transport, an LST or a Liberty ship, could carry enough sections to lay 1,500 feet of runway. Every shipment was a prefabricated airfield in waiting, bound for an island not yet invaded. Behind this machinery stood a new breed of soldier engineer, the Seabees. Formed from construction workers, welders, and miners, their motto, "We build, we fight," captured America's industrial spirit in uniform. By 1944, more than 325,000 Seabees operated across every ocean, building over 400 major airfields from Iceland to Saipan. Their logistics were choreographed on an epic scale. Convoys left San Francisco weeks before amphibious assaults, holds stacked with bulldozers, graders, cranes, and endless pallets of PSP. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's staff devoted entire naval task groups solely to advanced base construction. Each beachhead's success rested on this invisible armada of steel and planning. For Japan's war planners, the realization was chilling. Every American airfield captured or constructed meant another leap across the Pacific, faster than they could fortify or even respond. The Americans were not simply fighting battles, they were manufacturing geography itself. Each shining mat that glinted under a tropical sun was backed by thousands of anonymous laborers in Chicago, Cleveland, or Seattle, whose hammer strikes echoed across the ocean. As production accelerated, the Seabees prepared to unleash this industrial miracle on a scale the Pacific had never seen, beginning with the jungles of New Guinea and, soon after, the swamps of the Philippines. By mid-1943, General Douglas MacArthur's advance along New Guinea's north coast met its most unforgiving opponent, the land itself. Between the Owen Stanley foothills and the Bismarck Sea stretched miles of mangrove swamp, a landscape of black water, leeches, and sucking mud that swallowed boots whole. Yet MacArthur's plan demanded airfields here, bases close enough to strike the Japanese strongholds at Wewak and beyond, stepping stones on the long road back to the Philippines. At Nadzab, Leyte, and Oro Bay, Seabees and Australian engineers began a campaign not against soldiers, but against physics. The work defied logic. Bulldozers rumbled forward only to sink to their axles. Some were left entombed beneath the very runways they helped start. Men waded waist-deep in sludge, laying logs by hand to form corduroy foundations, then layering coral and gravel until the ground shuddered under its own weight. Finally came the pierced steel planking, interlocked, gleaming, and unyielding, stitched across the swamp like armor. Rain hammered down in sheets, yet the mats held. When one panel buckled under the weight of a C-47, the crew simply replaced it within hours. The floating airstrips of New Guinea were born, steel islands in a sea of mud. From the ridge lines, Japanese scouts watched in disbelief. Reports back to Rabaul spoke of runways appearing on water, Bombing raids cratered the surfaces, but the matting absorbed the shock, and by the next morning, aircraft were taking off again. Within weeks, P-38 Lightnings, B-25 Mitchells, and C-47 transports roared skyward from what had once been mangrove forest. Each field extended Allied reach another 100 miles toward the Philippines. By late 1944, these lessons had become doctrine. The Seabees could now raise a fighter strip in 72 hours, no matter the terrain. The stage was set for the miracle at Leyte, the day Airfields rose from Philippine swamps and left Japan's commanders in utter disbelief. By October 1944, Japan's last illusions of natural defense began to dissolve in the mud of the Philippines. At Tacloban, Dulag, and Barawan, the first American bulldozers came ashore still streaked with salt spray, grinding through marshes that Japanese maps labeled impassable. Within days, the swamp trembled beneath their treads as the Seabees and Army engineers laid down thousands of panels of pierced steel planking. The air shimmered with diesel fumes and humidity, while mosquitoes rose in black clouds from the mangroves. Yet through it all, the Americans worked without pause. By the third dawn, the first P-38 Lightnings were already lifting from what, a week earlier, had been waist-deep bog. Japanese airmen circling overhead radioed back in confusion. Their coordinates showed nothing but wetland, yet there, through breaks in the monsoon clouds, gleamed silver lines of steel and the slow, deliberate movement of aircraft taxiing across waterlogged plains. Intercepted transmissions from the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service described ghost fields and runways floating upon the sea. The impossible had become routine. The same terrain that Japanese planners once trusted to delay an invasion had turned traitor, offering the Americans firm ground where there was none. For frontline troops, the effect was devastating. Soldiers who had believed that mud and jungle were their allies now watched B-24 Liberators rise from the very swamps they had called safe. Their morale bled away with each sortie that thundered overhead. Even Japanese engineers, upon inspecting captured strips, conceded defeat. No amount of bamboo or timber could match America's steel. One American Seabee joked that the jungle ran out of mud before we ran out of matting, and for once it was not an exaggeration. Each completed runway shouted inevitability. The United States had mastered nature itself. And from Leyte's gleaming airfields, the road to Luzon, and the heart of Japan's empire, was already open. Speed had become America's deadliest new weapon. In the final months of 1944, the Seabees' mastery of swamp construction reshaped Allied operations in the Philippines and beyond. When MacArthur's invasion convoys hit Leyte's beaches, engineers landed within minutes of the first assault waves. Bulldozers, still dripping seawater, rolled straight from landing craft into the mud and began carving runways. At Tacloban and San Pablo, airfields were declared operational within 72 hours, a feat no Japanese planner had ever imagined possible. The moment the first steel sheets locked into place, P-38s and B-24s were already taking off to strike Japanese convoys and airfields still being assembled. For the first time in the Pacific War, American ground troops advanced under constant air cover from the day of landing. What once required weeks of staging and transport now unfolded in days. Each new strip became a logistical hub. Fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies flowed directly from Liberty ships into aircraft, bypassing long and vulnerable sea routes. From Leyte, bombers reached Formosa. From Luzon, they could strike Okinawa. The war's tempo accelerated beyond anything Japan's defensive plans could match. Intelligence summaries from Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters in December 1944 admitted grimly that enemy airfields multiply faster than we can bomb them. For Japan's forces, time itself turned hostile. Every swamp they hoped would delay the Americans instead birthed another base, another leap forward. For the United States, this speed compressed entire campaigns. Operations once expected to take months concluded in weeks. Air power, logistics, and industry had fused into a single, relentless machine. Yet even miracles of steel had limits, and as the war pushed north toward Okinawa and Iwo Jima, new problems emerged: corrosion, collapse, and nature's slow revenge on those temporary fields of metal. For all their brilliance, the swamp airfields were never meant to last. The same tropical rains that had once threatened to drown the engineers now began eating away at their creations. Within weeks, pierced steel planking, so bright when first laid, dulled to orange-brown as rust bloomed in the seams. Beneath the surface, trapped rainwater turned stagnant, breeding clouds of mosquitoes and the diseases that followed. At Munda, Biak, and Nadzab, maintenance became a daily battle. Seabees sloshed through ankle-deep puddles, spreading bitumen coatings, carving drainage trenches, and replacing buckled sections one by one. Each runway demanded constant vigilance. Steel, it turned out, had its own kind of fatigue. By late 1944, the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks introduced a successor, aluminum landing plank, or ALP. It was lighter, easier to handle, and far more resistant to corrosion, but even aluminum bowed before the Pacific's fury. Typhoons swept across Leyte and Tacloban, tearing up entire fields in a single night. Men awoke to find runways peeled apart like playing cards, PSP panels scattered into the mangroves. Yet the true strength of the system was not permanence, it was speed. The same crews that built an airstrip in 72 hours could rebuild it in 24. By dawn after a storm, aircraft were landing again, and operations resumed as if nothing had happened. Japan had no such resilience. Their airfields, hacked by hand from jungle and coral, crumbled under monsoon rain. With little steel and fewer machines, repairs took weeks, not hours. The Americans had mastered not endurance but adaptability, a doctrine that valued repair as much as construction. That mindset would outlast the war itself. In the decades to come, from Korea to Vietnam, the lessons of those floating runways would shape how modern militaries built in hostile terrain. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the legacy of the Pacific swamp airfields extended far beyond the tropics that birthed them. What began as improvisation under fire had become a blueprint for modern aviation. The same pierced steel planking that once bristled under B-24s was refined into lighter aluminum landing mats, used in Korea, Vietnam, and even the Arctic, where engineers built ice runways for scientific stations. The Seabees methods, layered drainage, modular surfaces, and rapid assembly, became the backbone of post-war civil engineering. Around the world, emergency and relief airstrips drew directly from their wartime manuals, proving that mobility could be engineered anywhere, under any conditions. In Japan itself, the transformation carried a deep irony. At Atsugi, Yokota, and Iwakuni, occupying American forces expanded airfields using the same modular steel planking that had once filled Japanese intelligence reports with dread. The technology that symbolized defeat now rebuilt the country's infrastructure, laying the foundations for a new civil aviation network. For Japanese engineers watching the reconstruction, the lesson was unmistakable. What once inspired fear had become a tool for recovery. Seabee training guides, once stamped restricted, entered civilian libraries and universities. Development agencies in Asia and Africa studied them as models for runway construction in tropical zones. The idea of portable infrastructure, building systems that could move as quickly as the mission demanded, reshaped both military and humanitarian logistics. From expeditionary bases in the Cold War to UN relief operations decades later, every modular airstrip owed a debt to the swamps of Leyte and New Guinea. Even today, modern expeditionary airfields still carry the same DNA: interlocking panels, rapid deployment, and the triumph of engineering over environment. The war that turned mud into metal had ended, but its innovations continued to lift aircraft and nations into the sky. Leyte, late 1944. The rain has stopped, and steam rises from the swamp as if the island itself exhales. Bulldozers crawl through water that reaches their treads, engines growling in steady rhythm, while Seabees in soaked uniforms hammer the last sheets of pierced steel planking into place. The sun breaks through the haze, catching on 1,000 perforated panels that gleam like mirrors, each one a fragment of human will pressed into the earth. By war's end, scenes like this were no longer extraordinary. The miracle had become procedure. Wherever an American flag landed, A runway soon followed. For Japanese commanders, those airfields on swamps became a symbol of something larger than defeat. They represented the moment when courage and tradition yielded to the sheer weight of organization, logistics, and industry, when geography itself ceased to be a defense. The sight of bombers lifting from what their maps marked as marshland captured the war's new truth. The impossible had been made routine, yet beyond conquest lay a quieter triumph. These men, engineers, welders, mechanics, proved that ingenuity could bend even the most hostile terrain to human purpose. The same hands that built runways from mud would later raise highways, airports, and cities from ruin. Their legacy endures not in the roar of engines, but in every paved line that begins where the earth once said no. The war fades, but the steel remains, shining beneath a tropical sun that once saw the impossible take flight.